I never intended to let my family believe I was just a hospital cleaner for 8 years, but when your own brother dismisses your work as peasant labor while you're secretly saving lives as one of the top cardiac surgeons in the state, sometimes the truth becomes a scalpel you save for the precise moment it's needed most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That moment came at my nephew's graduation party, when my brother's cardiologist walked into our family's backyard and changed everything with 3 simple words: Dr. Thorne. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if the story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible tale of hidden truth that will leave you speechless. My name is Lydia Thorne, and according to my family, I was the embodiment of wasted potential wrapped in janitor scrubs. The daughter who, quote, threw away her future by dropping out of Whitmore Medical School during her residency to pursue what my brother Ryan dismissively called mopping floors and emptying bedpans. For the past 8 years, I had carefully maintained the fiction that I worked as a night shift custodian at Riverside General Hospital in the small city of Millbrook, struggling to make ends meet in a cramped studio apartment on Cedar Street. What they didn't know was that I hadn't dropped out of medical school at all. What started as a misunderstanding during a particularly difficult period in my residency had evolved into an elaborate deception that protected both my privacy and my sanity. The truth was that Dr. Lydia Thorne was one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons on the East Coast. I was the head of cardiovascular surgery at 3 prestigious hospitals: Riverside General, Metropolitan Heart Institute, and St. Catherine's Medical Center. Last year alone, I had performed over 400 life-saving surgeries, published 12 peer-reviewed papers in medical journals, and earned nearly $800,000 in salary and consultation fees. But to my family, I was still the disappointing daughter who couldn't handle the pressure of medical school and had settled for pushing a mop cart through hospital corridors for $15 an hour. The deception hadn't been intentional at first. 8 years ago, during my final year of cardiac surgery residency, I had gone through what medical professionals call a dark period. The combination of 80-hour work weeks, 3 patient deaths in a single month, and the crushing weight of life or death decisions had pushed me to the edge of a breakdown. I had taken a brief leave of absence to recover my mental health, something that was both necessary and completely normal in the demanding world of surgical training. During those few weeks off, when my family asked how I was doing, I had mentioned that I was just cleaning up some things at the hospital while I figured out my next steps. My brother Ryan, always quick to assume the worst about my capabilities, had somehow interpreted this to mean that I had quit medical school and taken a custodial job. When I tried to clarify, he cut me off with a lecture about how he saw this coming and how medical school was always too much for someone like me. The assumption stung so badly that I simply stopped trying to correct it. When I returned to complete my residency and began my fellowship in cardiac surgery, I let my family continue believing their version of events. When I landed my first attending position and started saving lives in operating rooms across 3 hospitals, I maintained the fiction of my humble custodial work. What had begun as wounded pride had evolved into something more complex, a social experiment that revealed uncomfortable truths about my family's perception of success, intelligence, and worth. I lived modestly when visiting them, drove a 10-year-old Honda Accord to family gatherings, and wore scrubs that could easily be mistaken for custodial uniforms. My real life, the luxury time house in Hillbrook Heights, the collection of medical awards lining my home office walls, the BMW I drove to work, remained carefully hidden from their view. My brother Ryan Thorne had never struggled with family perception. At 36, 4 years my senior, he was everything our parents had dreamed of in a firstborn child. A successful corporate attorney at Brennan, Foster & Associates, one of Millbrook's most established law firms. He graduated from Columbia Law School, married his college sweetheart Natalie, and lived in a beautiful colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive with their twin daughters, Ashley and Emma. Ryan drove a Mercedes-Benz, wore custom-tailored suits, and had never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in our family about the importance of making smart career choices and not settling for less than your potential.
He was also the most condescending person I had ever known, though he disguised his cruelty as concern for my well-being. "Lydia's here with her work clothes again," he would announce whenever I arrived at family gatherings, his voice dripping with a mixture of pity and superiority. "How's the night shift treating you, sis? Still enjoying that honest work?" The emphasis he placed on honest work always carried the implication that while my work might be honest, it was certainly not intelligent, ambitious, or worthy of respect.
The family would respond with polite smiles and gentle encouragement, treating me like a well-meaning relative who had simply chosen a different path in life. What they didn't know was that the work clothes Ryan mocked were actually medical scrubs that I wore because they were comfortable and practical, not because I was required to wear them for custodial duties. My parents, Helen and Robert Thorne, had long since adjusted their expectations for their younger daughter. Dad, a retired high school principal, would pat my shoulder sympathetically and ask if I needed help with managing the physical demands of my job. Mom, a former nurse herself, would sigh wistfully whenever someone asked about her children, always leading with Ryan's legal achievements and mentioning my employment as an afterthought. "Ryan just made senior associate at his firm," she would say with obvious pride. "And Lydia, well, Lydia is working hard at the hospital. She's very dedicated to her work, even if it's not what we originally hoped for her." Not what we originally hoped for. The phrase had become a familiar refrain, a gentle way of acknowledging that I had fallen short of the family's medical aspirations while still maintaining some dignity about my chosen path. If only they knew that I had not only met those aspirations, but exceeded them in ways they couldn't imagine. The most painful part wasn't Ryan's casual cruelty or my parents' disappointed acceptance. It was the genuine belief that I had simply lacked the intelligence, drive, or emotional fortitude to succeed in medicine. They spoke to me the way you might speak to someone who had tried their best but simply wasn't cut out for greatness. They offered encouragement for small achievements and gentle guidance about finding fulfillment in service work or taking pride in keeping things clean and organized. I had become an expert at playing down to their expectations. I had perfected the art of looking slightly overwhelmed when they discussed complex medical procedures or cutting-edge treatments. I had mastered the skill of appearing grateful when they offered advice about finding meaning in service work or taking pride in keeping things clean and organized. But maintaining this double life was becoming increasingly difficult. My medical career was reaching new heights of visibility and recognition. I had been featured in Cardiothoracic Surgery Today, interviewed by Medical Excellence Quarterly, and invited to present at the International Cardiac Surgery Conference in Geneva. The awards were accumulating in my real office: Surgeon of the Year, Innovation in Cardiac Care, Outstanding Achievement in Life-Saving Procedures. Yet, at family dinners, I was still the girl who had failed to become a doctor and settled for mopping hospital floors. The irony wasn't lost on me that Ryan, for all his legal success and professional prestige, had never actually saved a human life. He had never held someone's beating heart in his hands, never brought a patient back from the brink of death, never experienced the profound responsibility of making split-second decisions that determined whether families would be celebrating or grieving. While he negotiated contracts and filed motions, I was performing miracles in operating rooms across the state. But in our family's narrative, he was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale about what happens when you can't handle pressure and settle for less. Tonight was going to be different, though I didn't know it yet. Tonight, at my nephew Jake's high school graduation party, the carefully constructed walls between my two lives were about to collapse in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. Because sometimes fate has its own timing, and sometimes that timing involves your brother's cardiologist recognizing you as the surgeon who saved his colleague's life just 3 months earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Jake's graduation party was being held at Ryan and Natalie's house on Maple Ridge Drive, the kind of sprawling suburban home that screamed success to anyone who drove past. The backyard had been transformed into a celebration worthy of a magazine spread. White tents strung with lights, catered tables from Romano's Italian Bistro, and a photo display chronicling Jake's achievements from Little League to valedictorian. I arrived at exactly 6:30 p.m., carrying a modest gift bag containing a leather portfolio I'd purchased from a department store. Nothing too expensive that might raise questions about my supposed financial situation as a night shift custodian making barely above minimum wage. I had spent considerable time that afternoon selecting my outfit, clean medical scrubs that I'd deliberately chosen in hospital custodial colors, comfortable walking shoes, and a simple cardigan to make the scrubs look more casual than professional.
"Oh, that's so sweet of you, dear," she said, though her voice carried that familiar tone of gentle praise reserved for simple gestures. "Jake will be so happy you made it. You know how much it means to him when his Aunt Lydia shows up." The way she said Aunt Lydia always carried a subtle emphasis, as if my presence was somehow more meaningful because of my humble circumstances. As if Jake would be particularly touched that his working-class aunt had made the effort to attend his celebration. What Mom didn't know was that I had actually rearranged 2 surgeries and delegated a consultation to be here tonight. The shift I had just finished involved performing a complex aortic valve replacement that had saved the life of a 54-year-old construction worker whose family was probably having their own celebration tonight, grateful that their father would be coming home. The family was gathered on the brick patio when I walked into the backyard. Dad sat in his favorite lawn chair, wearing the new polo shirt Ryan had bought him for Father's Day, looking content as he held court with Uncle Marcus and family friend Mrs. Henderson. Ryan stood near the outdoor bar, resplendent in what I recognized as an expensive casual blazer, regaling a small group with some story about his latest legal victory. And when the opposing counsel realized we had the precedent case they'd overlooked, you should have seen their faces, Ryan was saying, his voice carrying that particular blend of smugness and satisfaction that I'd come to know so well. Sometimes it's not about how loud you argue, it's about how thoroughly you've done your homework. The small audience murmured appreciatively. Ryan had always possessed a gift for making himself the center of attention, for crafting narratives where he emerged as the brilliant strategist who outmaneuvered less prepared opponents. "Ryan, you're just so impressive," cooed Mrs. Henderson, who had been our neighbor when we were children and still treated Ryan like the golden boy who could do no wrong. "Your parents must be so proud of both your children's success." I watched Dad's face light up with obvious pride. "We certainly are," he said, his chest puffing out. "Senior associate at 36, and the partners are already talking about making him the youngest partner in the firm's history." Ryan accepted the praise with practiced humility, straightening his blazer with false modesty. "Well, you know what they say about hard work paying off. When you're willing to put in the hours and really dedicate yourself to excellence, opportunities have a way of presenting themselves." I settled into a corner chair near the garden, the same spot I'd unconsciously claimed at family gatherings for years. Close enough to participate in conversations, but far enough from the center to avoid drawing unwanted attention to myself. It was a position I'd mastered, the art of being present but invisible, supportive but not competitive. Jake bounded over to me with the enthusiasm of an 18-year-old who had just graduated as valedictorian and was headed to Princeton on a full academic scholarship. He was Ryan's son in every way that mattered. Tall, confident, academically gifted, and destined for the kind of success that our family recognized and celebrated. "Aunt Lydia," he said, giving me a hug that was genuine but slightly awkward, the way teenagers hug adults they care about but don't quite know how to relate to. "I'm so glad you could make it. I know your work schedule is crazy." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said, meaning every word. Despite everything, I loved my nephew deeply. He was smart, kind, and had somehow avoided inheriting his father's condescending streak.
Congratulations on Princeton. That's an incredible achievement. Jake beamed with pride, but then his expression grew more serious. You know, Aunt Lydia, I've always admired how hard you work. I mean, I know being on the night shift at the hospital isn't glamorous, but you've stuck with it for years. That takes real dedication. The comment was meant as genuine praise, but it highlighted exactly how the family saw me. Someone whose greatest virtue was persistence in unglamorous work. Not intelligence, not skill, not achievement, but the simple ability to keep showing up for a job that required no particular talent or education. Thank you, Jake, I said simply. I hope you find work that fulfills you the way mine fulfills me. Ryan appeared beside us, carrying a glass of wine and wearing the expression of benevolent big brother that he'd perfected over the years. Jake, your aunt is being modest, he said, his voice carrying that gentle correction. Custodial work is important work. Someone has to keep our hospitals clean and safe. Not everyone can be lawyers or doctors, and that's perfectly fine. The comment stung in ways that Ryan could possibly understand. Not everyone can be doctors. If only he knew that not only could I be a doctor, I was one of the best doctors in the state. That while he was filing motions and negotiating settlements, I was literally holding human hearts in my hands and bringing people back from the brink of death. That's right, Dad chimed in, joining our small circle with Uncle Marcus in tow. Every job has dignity, Lydia. You provide an essential service that keeps people healthy and safe. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing to be ashamed of. The phrase was meant as encouragement, but it revealed their assumption that I might actually have something to be ashamed of in my work. That my job was the kind that required reassurance about its dignity rather than celebration of its achievement.
Uncle Marcus nodded sagely. Besides, not everyone has the temperament for high-pressure careers. Some people are better suited for steady, predictable work, where they don't have to make life-or-death decisions or handle enormous responsibility. I almost laughed out loud at the irony. Uncle Marcus, who sold insurance and had never faced anything more high-pressure than a difficult client meeting, was explaining to me about life-or-death decisions. Meanwhile, just 6 hours earlier, I had performed emergency surgery on a patient whose aortic dissection had given him maybe 20 minutes to live without immediate intervention. Exactly, Ryan agreed, his voice taking on the tone of someone dispensing wisdom to a less fortunate relative. Lydia has found her niche. She's good at the practical, hands-on work that keeps things running smoothly behind the scenes. Not everyone needs to be in the spotlight or handling complex cases. Behind the scenes. The phrase perfectly captured how they saw my role in the world. Invisible, supportive, necessary, but not noteworthy. They had no idea that I was actually one of the most visible surgeons in the regional medical community, that other doctors sought my consultation on their most complex cases, that I was frequently invited to speak at medical conferences about innovative surgical techniques. Natalie joined our conversation, looking perfectly polished in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was styled in effortless waves, and her makeup was flawless despite the humid evening air. I think it's wonderful that you found stability, Lydia, she said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle condescension that came naturally to someone who had never worried about money or status. So many people jump from job to job, never settling down or building any kind of security. There's something to be said for consistency. Consistency. Stability. These were the highest compliments my family could imagine for my career, that I had managed to keep the same low-level job for 8 years without getting fired or quitting in frustration. And the night shift must be nice in some ways, Mom added thoughtfully. Less supervision probably, quieter than the day shift chaos. You can work at your own pace without too much pressure. Less pressure.
I thought about the emergency surgery I had performed just this morning, where a patient had coded on the table, and I had spent 45 minutes fighting to restart his heart while his wife waited in the hallway, not knowing whether she would become a widow before lunch. But in my family's imagination, I spent my nights mopping floors and empty hospital corridors, listening to podcasts, and working at my own leisurely pace. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more family friends and neighbors, all eager to congratulate Jape on his achievements and discuss his bright future at Princeton. The attention naturally flowed towards Ryan as well, as people asked about his legal career and praised his success in raising such an accomplished son. I listened to the familiar rhythm of these gatherings, Ryan's achievements being celebrated, Jake's potential being discussed, and my own life being acknowledged with gentle encouragement and carefully worded reassurance about the dignity of simple work. What none of them knew was that tomorrow morning, while they slept in their comfortable beds, I would be walking into the operating room at Metropolitan Heart Institute to perform a procedure that only 12 surgeons in the country were qualified to attempt. A surgery that would save the life of a young mother whose children would get to grow up with their mom because of skills I had spent years perfecting in secret. As I sat in that corner chair listening to my family discuss the importance of realistic career expectations and finding fulfillment in honest work, I couldn't help but think about what my real Monday morning would actually look like. While they imagined me clocking in for another night of mopping hospital corridors, I would be walking into the cardiac surgery wing at Metropolitan Heart Institute as the department head, preparing for a breakthrough procedure that had been scheduled for months. The surgery was a complex case that had been referred to me from Johns Hopkins, a 34-year-old engineer named David Chen, who had been born with a rare congenital heart defect that was now threatening his life. The procedure required a technique that I had pioneered myself, combining traditional surgical methods with cutting-edge robotic assistance. Only a handful of surgeons worldwide had the expertise to attempt it, and Chen's family had traveled from Baltimore specifically to have me perform the operation. What made this case particularly significant was that it would be observed by medical students from 3 different universities, filmed for educational purposes, and likely featured in the next issue of Advanced Cardiac Surgery Quarterly. The medical world was watching this procedure, and I was the surgeon they trusted to push the boundaries of what was possible in cardiac care. But to my family, I was the sister who couldn't handle the pressure of medical school and had settled for pushing a mop bucket through empty hospital corridors. The deception had evolved far beyond what I had originally intended. What started as wounded silence in the face of Ryan's assumptions had become an elaborate performance that required constant attention to detail. I maintained 2 complete wardrobes, the modest clothes and worn scrubs that I wore to family events, and the professional attire that filled the walk-in closet of my real home in Hillbrook Heights.
My actual residence was a luxury townhouse in the most prestigious neighborhood in Millbrook, complete with a home office lined with medical degrees, board certifications, and awards that told the true story of my career. The walls displayed photographs of me with colleagues at international medical conferences, letters of gratitude from patients whose lives I had saved, and newspaper clippings from the Millbrook Herald featuring my work establishing the region's first pediatric cardiac surgery program. The garage of that townhouse contained not just the aging Honda Accord that my family knew about, but also the BMW sedan that I drove to work and the motorcycle that I took on weekend rides through the mountain roads outside the city. My real life was filled with the kind of luxury that my surgical salary afforded. Season tickets to the symphony, a wine collection worth more than most people's annual salary, and a vacation home in the mountains where I retreated between particularly difficult cases. But maintaining this double life required constant vigilance. I had learned to compartmentalize my existence so completely that sometimes I felt like I was living the life of a spy. I maintained 2 different cell phones, the basic model that my family occasionally saw me use, and the smartphone that buzzed constantly with calls from other physicians, hospital administrators, and medical equipment companies seeking my consultation. My social media presence was carefully curated to support the deception. The Facebook account that my family could access showed photos of me in casual clothes, posts about working long hours, and check-ins at modest restaurants and coffee shops. Meanwhile, my professional LinkedIn profile, which used only my initials, LM Thorne, showcased a completely different life, speaking engagements at medical conferences, publications in prestigious journals, and endorsements from colleagues who described me as one of the most innovative cardiac surgeons of her generation. The medical community knew me as Dr. L.M. Thorne, the surgeon who had revolutionized treatment for certain types of congenital heart defects. I had published 47 peer-reviewed papers, held patents on 3 surgical instruments, and had been invited to consult on cases in 12 different countries. Last year, I had been named Cardiac Surgeon of the Year by the American College of Surgeons, an honor that had been presented at a gala dinner attended by 500 of the most distinguished physicians in the nation. But when the awards ceremony was held, I told my family I was working a double shift at the hospital to cover for a sick colleague. They praised my work ethic and dedication to helping others, never imagining that their struggling night shift custodian was actually being celebrated as one of the finest surgeons in America. The financial aspects of the deception were equally complex. My annual income from surgical fees, consultation work, and speaking engagements totaled approximately $850,000, making me one of the highest-paid medical professionals in the region. But I lived modestly when around my family, carefully maintaining the appearance of someone who earned perhaps $35,000 per year and struggled to make ends meet. I had become expert at deflecting questions about money by mentioning the challenges of night shift work and the unpredictability of hospital schedules. When Ryan occasionally offered to help with what he assumed were my financial difficulties, I would thank him graciously while internally calculating that I earned more in a single surgery than he made in most months. The charitable giving alone would have shocked them. Through various foundations and anonymous donations, I contributed over $200,000 annually to medical research, educational scholarships, and community health programs. Just last month, I had quietly funded the purchase of a new cardiac monitoring system for the children's ward at Riverside General, the same hospital where my family believed I mopped floors for minimum wage. My colleagues in the medical field knew me as someone who was intensely private about her personal life, but utterly dedicated to advancing cardiac surgery and training the next generation of physicians. I mentored residents and young surgeons, taught advanced techniques to experienced doctors, and frequently served on medical review boards that evaluated new procedures and treatments. The irony of my situation became most apparent during family conversations about healthcare. Just 2 months ago, at Easter dinner, Uncle Marcus had launched into a complaint about his cardiologist's recommendation for a procedure he didn't think he needed. He had described the doctor as arrogant and questioned whether specialists really knew what they were talking about. "These heart doctors act like they're gods," he had said, while I sat quietly, eating ham, and listening to him dismiss the very field in which I had achieved international recognition. Half the time, they're just looking for ways to bill insurance companies for expensive procedures that probably aren't necessary. Ryan had agreed enthusiastically, adding his own criticism of medical professionals who hide behind their degrees and talk down to regular people who ask reasonable questions. The conversation had continued for 20 minutes, with various family members sharing their skepticism about cardiac specialists, while I, one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the region, nodded politely and offered sympathetic murmurs about the challenges of navigating the healthcare system.
But perhaps the most painful aspect of the deception was how it affected my relationship with Mom, who had been a nurse for 30 years before retiring. She understood the medical field better than anyone else in the family, and sometimes I caught glimpses of curiosity in her eyes when hospital-related topics came up in conversation. She would ask carefully worded questions about my observations of medical procedures or my thoughts about new treatments she had read about in nursing journals.
Those moments were the hardest to navigate because I could see her professional instincts recognizing that I knew more than a custodian should know about complex medical procedures. But rather than pursuing those instincts, she would always pull back, probably assuming that I had simply picked up information through proximity to medical professionals rather than through actual expertise. Last Christmas, she had shown me an article about advances in cardiac surgery and asked if I had seen any of these new techniques being used at the hospital. I had been forced to give vague answers about overhearing doctors discuss new procedures, when the truth was that I had actually developed one of the techniques mentioned in the article and had trained surgeons from 4 different hospitals in its application. The emotional toll of this constant performance was something I had not anticipated when the deception first began. There were nights when I would return home from saving someone's life in a complex surgery only to receive a text from Mom asking if I was staying warm during those long night shifts, or from Dad wondering if I needed help with my modest expenses. Their love and concern for me was genuine, but it was based on a completely false understanding of who I was and what my life looked like. They worried about my financial security, while I worried about whether I had the emotional strength to continue pretending that their concern was necessary. They encouraged me to keep working hard and stay dedicated, while I was already working at a level of dedication that few people in any profession ever achieved. The most challenging part was maintaining relationships with medical colleagues while keeping my family life completely separate. Dr. Patricia Wong, my closest friend and the chief of surgery at St. Catherine's Medical Center, knew me as a brilliant surgeon with an unusually private personal life. She had invited me to dinner parties and social events, but I always declined, citing family obligations that I couldn't explain without revealing the truth about my deception. Similarly, the residents and medical students I mentored knew me as Dr. Thorne, the demanding but supportive teacher who expected excellence and delivered it consistently. They had no idea that the confident, authoritative physician who guided them through complex procedures went home to maintain an elaborate fiction about working as a hospital custodian. The medical conferences were particularly difficult to explain. When I traveled to present papers or attend surgical workshops, I would tell my family that I was picking up extra shifts at other hospitals or helping with special cleaning projects. They praised my work ethic and dedication, never imagining that their supposedly struggling sister was actually being flown to medical centers across the country to share her expertise with other surgeons. But tonight was going to be different, though I had no way of knowing it yet. Tonight, the 2 worlds I had so carefully kept separate were about to collide in the most unexpected way possible, and the performance I had maintained for 8 years was about to come to an abrupt and dramatic end. Because sometimes the universe has its own sense of timing, and sometimes that timing involves exactly the right person being in exactly the right place at exactly the moment when the truth can no longer be hidden. The evening progressed into what I had come to think of as the Lydia Improvement Hour, that inevitable portion of family gatherings where everyone felt compelled to offer unsolicited advice about how I could better my supposedly unfortunate circumstances. It was as predictable as the sunset and twice as painful, a ritual where my family's good intentions collided with their complete misunderstanding of my actual life. Aunt Beverly, Dad's older sister, who had driven down from Northfield for Jake's graduation, was the first to launch into what she clearly considered helpful career guidance. Beverly worked as a human resources director at a regional insurance company and considered herself an expert on workplace advancement and professional development. "You know, Lydia," she said, cutting into her slice of graduation cake, "I was talking to our facilities manager last week about staffing challenges.
We're always looking for reliable people in building maintenance and cleaning services. The pay isn't spectacular, maybe $18 an hour to start, but it's day shift work with weekends off and full benefits. The suggestion hung in the air like a generous lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. $18 an hour? I made more than that every 3 minutes during surgery. But I was supposed to be grateful for this opportunity to escape the supposed drudgery of night shift hospital work. Ryan nearly choked on his wine, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. Come on, Lydia. Beverly is offering you a real opportunity here. Day shift, benefits, a normal schedule where you could actually have a social life. When was the last time you went on a date? When was the last time you did anything besides work and sleep? The questions stung because they revealed how thoroughly my family had accepted their narrative about my limited, exhausting existence. The truth was that I had a rich personal life filled with activities they couldn't imagine, like wine tastings with fellow physicians, weekend trips to medical conferences that doubled as vacations, and yes, even romantic relationships with other professionals who understood the demands of a medical career.
Just last month, I had spent a long weekend in Boston with Dr. Michael Rivera, a neurosurgeon I had met at a conference in Chicago. We had attended the symphony, dined at restaurants they wouldn't have heard of, and discussed surgical techniques over wine that cost more per bottle than my family thought I made in a week. I appreciate everyone's concern, I said quietly, but my work at the hospital is fulfilling. Not everyone needs the same things to be happy. Natalie leaned forward with the expression of someone about to share profound wisdom. But Lydia, fulfillment doesn't pay the bills. You're 32 years old and you're still living in that tiny apartment, driving a car that's practically falling apart. Don't you want more for yourself? The tiny apartment they referenced was actually just my cover story, a modest studio I maintained for appearances when family members occasionally drove past what they thought was my residence. My real townhouse in Hillbrook Heights had 4 bedrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and a monthly mortgage payment that exceeded what they thought I earned in 6 months. Uncle Marcus set down his fork and assumed the posture of someone preparing to deliver important life advice. The thing is, Lydia, there comes a time when you have to stop being stubborn and start being practical. This hospital cleaning job was fine as a temporary solution, but 8 years? At some point, you need to admit that it's not leading anywhere. Not leading anywhere. I thought about the complex surgery I had scheduled for Tuesday, where I would attempt to repair a heart defect in a 6-month-old baby whose parents had traveled from 3 states away because I was one of only 4 surgeons in the country qualified to perform the procedure. But in Uncle Marcus's worldview, my career was a dead-end job that demonstrated a lack of ambition and foresight. Marcus is right, Dad added, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority. We've watched you work these night shifts for years, coming home exhausted, barely making ends meet. Maybe it's time to consider that there might be better opportunities out there. Jake, my nephew, looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but felt compelled to contribute his perspective. I mean, Aunt Lydia, you're obviously a hard worker. Maybe you could use that experience to move into hospital administration or something. You know, work your way up from the ground floor. Work my way up from the ground floor. The irony was breathtaking. I was already at the top of my profession, literally saving lives and training other doctors, while my family discussed my potential for someday advancing to basic administrative work. Mrs. Henderson nodded sagely. My daughter's friend started in hospital maintenance and eventually became a unit secretary. It took her 15 years, but now she has a desk job with regular hours. Sometimes you have to be patient, improve yourself over time. 15 years to become a unit secretary? Meanwhile, I had completed medical school, residency, and fellowship, established myself as a leading cardiac surgeon, and earned international recognition for my contributions to the field. But they saw my greatest potential achievement as possibly working my way up to answering phones at a nurse's station. Ryan's voice took on the tone of concerned big brother mixed with professional expertise. Look, Lydia, I deal with employment law, so I understand workplace dynamics. The problem with jobs like yours is that there's no real career ladder. You can be the best custodian in the world, but where does that get you? Maybe a supervisor position if you're lucky, but you're still basically doing the same work for barely more money. If only he knew that my custodial work had earned me invitations to lecture at Harvard Medical School, consult on cases at the Mayo Clinic, and develop surgical protocols that were being adopted by hospitals across the country. While he filed briefs and negotiated contracts, I was literally reshaping how cardiac surgery was being performed. Aunt Beverly pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be job listings. Actually, let me show you some opportunities that might interest you. There's a receptionist position at our company, $16 an hour, but it's clean work in an office environment. Or here's something at the community college, administrative assistant in the nursing program. That might be perfect for someone with your hospital background. Administrative assistant in the nursing program. The suggestion was so absurd that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. I regularly gave guest lectures to nursing students about cardiac care, and just last semester, I was the keynote speaker at the state nursing convention. But Beverly envisioned my hospital background, qualifying me to file paperwork for nursing instructors. Natalie was scrolling through her own phone, clearly inspired by the job-hunting momentum. Oh, here's something interesting. The pediatric clinic where we take the girls is looking for someone to help with patient check-in and basic office duties. It's only part-time, but the hours are perfect, 9 to 3, so you'd be done before school lets out. Very family-friendly environment. Family-friendly environment. I thought about the pediatric cardiac surgery program I had established at Metropolitan Heart Institute, where I performed life-saving operations on children and provided hope to families facing their worst nightmares. But Natalie saw my potential contribution to pediatric care as checking insurance cards and scheduling appointments.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more neighbors and family friends, all eager to celebrate Jake's achievements and discuss his bright future at Princeton. The attention naturally flowed back toward Ryan as people asked about his legal career and praised his success in raising such an accomplished son. But the job search discussion had gained momentum, and soon multiple conversations were happening simultaneously around the patio, all focused on solving the problem of my career situation. The key is being realistic about your starting point, Mrs. Henderson was explaining to Aunt Beverly. Lydia has been out of the professional workforce for so long that she'll need to start over in many ways. But that's okay. Lots of people change careers in their 30s. Out of the professional workforce. I was literally at the peak of professional achievement, publishing research, teaching other doctors, and being consulted on the most complex cases in my field. But because they couldn't see my professional life, they had concluded that it didn't exist. Uncle Marcus had found something on his phone that excited him. Here's a perfect opportunity, Lydia. The hospital where you work is advertising for patient transport technicians. You know, the people who wheel patients to different departments. It's still hospital work, so you'd be comfortable with the environment, but it's more people-focused than cleaning. And I bet your supervisors would give you excellent references. Patient transport. I thought about the dozens of patients I had guided through complex surgical procedures, holding their hands before surgery and being the first face they saw when they woke up alive. But Uncle Marcus envisioned my advancement as pushing wheelchairs through hospital corridors. Dad was deep in conversation with several neighbors about employment strategies, gesturing occasionally in my direction as he explained my situation. I caught fragments of his words. Good work ethic, reliable, just needs the right opportunity. Sometimes people get comfortable in situations that aren't ideal. Ryan had assumed his lawyer persona, offering professional advice about resume writing and interview techniques. The thing Lydia needs to understand is that she's basically starting over career-wise. 8 years of night shift custodial work doesn't translate to many other fields, so she'll need to emphasize soft skills, reliability, ability to work independently, familiarity with healthcare environments. Starting over career-wise. While he dispensed advice about building a professional reputation, I was already being invited to join medical panels, review manuscripts for surgical journals, and evaluate new surgical techniques for the FDA.
But in his mind, I was a blank slate who needed to learn how to present herself professionally. The most painful part of these conversations wasn't the condescension or the misguided advice. It was the genuine love and concern behind them. These people cared about me and wanted to see me succeed. But their definitions of success was so limited, so narrow, that they couldn't conceive of achievement outside their own experiences. They saw a sister, daughter, and aunt who had struggled for 8 years in a job that offered no advancement or recognition, and they wanted to rescue me from what they perceived as a trap of low expectations and limited ambition. Their advice came from a place of affection, which made it impossible to dismiss entirely, even though every suggestion revealed how completely they misunderstood my actual circumstances. As the evening wore on and the job search brainstorming continued, I found myself thinking about tomorrow's surgery schedule. While my family plotted my escape from imaginary poverty and dead-end work, I would be performing procedures that pushed the boundaries of medical science and literally saved lives that other surgeons had written off as hopeless. The disconnect between their perception and my reality had never felt more acute, and I realized that the elaborate deception I had maintained for 8 years had created a prison of its own. I was trapped, not by limited opportunities or lack of ambition, but by my own success at convincing the people I loved that I was someone I had never been. But I had no way of knowing that this particular evening of well-meaning career advice was about to come to an abrupt and shocking end, because sometimes the truth has its own timeline, and that timeline was about to collide with my family's comfortable assumptions in the most dramatic way possible. The conversation about my supposed career salvation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the sliding glass doors that led from the patio to the kitchen, I could see the distinctive silver Lexus sedan pulling up behind Ryan's Mercedes, its headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. My stomach dropped as I recognized the vehicle and, more importantly, recognized the tall, distinguished figure stepping out of the driver's seat. Even in the dim light filtering from the house, there was no mistaking the commanding presence of Dr. Samuel Harrison as he straightened his suit jacket and checked his watch with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making every minute count. Who could that be at this hour? Mom wondered aloud, craning her neck to get a better view through the kitchen windows. We weren't expecting anyone else, were we, Ryan? My heart began to race as I watched Dr. Harrison walk toward the front door with the confident stride of someone who had important business to conduct. Samuel Harrison was not just any doctor. He was Ryan's cardiologist, the physician who had been treating my brother for the mild arrhythmia he'd developed 6 months ago. More importantly, Dr. Harrison was also a colleague of mine, someone that I had worked with on several complex cases and who knew me as one of the premier cardiac surgeons in the region.
Oh my God, Ryan breathed, his wine glass nearly slipping from his hand as he followed my gaze toward the driveway. That's Dr. Harrison. That's my cardiologist. What would he be doing here? The entire patio fell silent as everyone turned to look, and I could feel my carefully constructed world beginning to tilt dangerously on its axis. Dr. Samuel Harrison was walking toward my family's front door, and he was carrying a leather briefcase with the purposeful manner of someone who had professional business to discuss. "Your cardiologist?" Dad repeated, his voice rising with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Is everything all right with your heart, son? Why would he come here instead of calling the office?" Ryan was already standing up, frantically smoothing his hair and adjusting his casual blazer. "I have no idea. My last appointment was fine. He said the medication was working perfectly and I didn't need to see him again for 6 months. Maybe there's some kind of emergency or new test results or—" His voice trailed off as the implications began to dawn on him. Doctors didn't make house calls for routine matters. They certainly didn't show up at family graduation parties unless something significant was happening. Natalie grabbed Ryan's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Ryan, this could be serious. Heart doctors don't just drop by people's houses. Should we be worried? Do you think something showed up in your blood work?" The speculation around the patio grew more anxious by the second, but I felt like I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Dr. Harrison wasn't here about Ryan's heart condition. He was here because of a conversation we'd had 3 days ago in the cardiac surgery lounge at Metropolitan Heart Institute. During our brief encounter while reviewing patient charts, Samuel had mentioned that he was treating a lawyer named Lydia Thorne for a minor cardiac issue. The name had caught my attention immediately, and when he described Ryan's age and law firm, I realized he was talking about my brother. In a moment of curiosity that I now deeply regretted, I had mentioned that Ryan was my brother. Samuel's reaction had been one of surprised delight. "Your brother? How wonderful! I had no idea you had family in the legal profession. Ryan speaks very highly of his sister who works at the hospital, though he mentioned you're in a different department. Facilities management, wasn't it?" I had nodded non-committally, not correcting his assumption, but Samuel had continued with enthusiasm. I've been meaning to talk to someone in hospital administration about updating our cardiac monitoring equipment. Perhaps we could discuss it sometime. And I'd love to meet Ryan's family properly. He mentioned something about a graduation party for his son this weekend. At the time, I had given vague responses and quickly changed the subject, hoping Samuel would forget about the conversation entirely. But as I watched him approaching our front door with obvious purpose, I realized that my casual mention of family connections had set in motion a chain of events that was about to explode my carefully maintained deception in the most spectacular way possible. The doorbell rang, and the sound seemed to echo across the patio like a gunshot. Everyone at the party froze, staring at each other with various expressions of concern, curiosity, and anticipation. "I'll get it," Dad said, starting to rise from his chair, his face creased with worry about why a cardiologist would be making an unscheduled house call. "No, let me," Ryan interjected quickly, already moving toward the sliding glass doors that led into the house. "He's obviously here to see me. This has to be about my heart condition." I remained seated in my corner chair, my hands folded in my lap, and watched this scene unfold with a mixture of dread and fascination. In about 30 seconds, my two worlds were going to collide with the force of a freight train, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to prevent it. Through the open sliding doors, I could hear Dad opening the front door, and Ryan's voice pitched higher than usual with nervous anxiety. "Dr. Harrison, what a surprise! Is everything all right? Please, come in." "Good evening, Ryan," came Samuel's distinctive voice, calm and professional as always. "I hope I'm not intruding on your family celebration. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to congratulate your son on his graduation. I also wanted to discuss something with your sister, if she's available." There was a moment of confused silence and then Ryan's bewildered response. "My sister? You want to talk to my sister? I'm not sure I understand, doctor. Lydia works at the hospital, but she's in custodial services. I don't think you would have had any reason to interact with her professionally." "Custodial services?" Samuel's voice carried a note of polite confusion. "I think there might be some misunderstanding, Ryan. I was hoping to speak with Dr. Thorne for a cardiac surgery consultation." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ice clinking in someone's glass on the patio. Every person at that graduation party was trying to process what they had just heard and failing completely. Ryan's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, traveling clearly through the evening air. "Dr. Thorne? I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong house. There's no doctor here, just my family and my sister who works cleaning at Riverside General."
No, Samuel replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone clearing up a simple confusion. "I'm looking for Dr. Lydia Thorne, the cardiac surgeon. She mentioned at the hospital earlier this week that her brother Ryan was one of my patients and that there was a family celebration this weekend. I've been hoping to discuss a complex case with her. She's one of the finest cardiac surgeons I've ever worked with." The words hit the patio like a bomb detonating in slow motion. I could feel every eye turning toward me, could sense the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to make sense of what they were hearing. The comfortable assumptions of 8 years were crumbling in real time, and I was watching my family's faces as their entire understanding of reality shifted beneath their feet. Uncle Marcus dropped his wine glass and it shattered on the brick patio with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. But nobody moved to clean it up. They were all too busy staring at me, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person Dr. Harrison was describing. Aunt Beverly's mouth had fallen open so wide I could see her dental work.
Natalie was clutching Ryan's abandoned wine glass like it was a lifeline. Jake was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if I had suddenly sprouted wings and begun speaking in ancient languages. Through the sliding doors, I could hear Ryan's voice growing more strained and desperate. Dr. Harrison, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. My sister Lydia isn't a doctor. She dropped out of medical school 8 years ago. She works the night shift cleaning hospital rooms. She lives in a studio apartment and drives a car that's falling apart. There's no way she could be the cardiac surgeon you're looking for. Dropped out of medical school? Samuel's voice carried genuine surprise and concern. Ryan, I think we need to clear this up. Dr. Lydia Thorne is the head of cardiac surgery at Metropolitan Heart Institute. She's one of the most respected surgeons in the region. Just last month, she performed a procedure that I referred to her, a complex aortic valve replacement that only a handful of surgeons in the country are qualified to attempt. The conversation was continuing in the front hallway, but I could see that everyone on the patio was straining to hear every word. Dad had gone completely pale. Mom was pressing her hand to her chest as if she couldn't breathe. Mrs. Henderson was making small, whimpering sounds of confusion. And then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching and Dr. Harrison's voice growing closer as Ryan apparently led him toward the backyard where the family was gathered. Perhaps if I could speak with her directly, Samuel was saying, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone trying to resolve an obviously complicated misunderstanding. I'm sure we can clear up any confusion about her professional credentials. This was it. The moment I had both dreaded and secretly anticipated for 8 years was finally here. There was no hiding, no deflecting, no way to maintain the elaborate fiction I had constructed. In about 10 seconds, Dr. Samuel Harrison was going to walk onto this patio, see me sitting in my corner chair, and address me with the respect and recognition that my medical expertise commanded. The performance was over. The deception was about to end, and my family was about to discover that the struggling custodian they had been trying to rescue was actually one of the most accomplished cardiac surgeons in the state. I took a deep breath and prepared to step out of the shadows of my own creation, because sometimes the truth has perfect timing, and sometimes that timing arrives in the form of a colleague who doesn't understand why a brilliant surgeon would let her family believe she pushes a mop for a living. And then Dr. Samuel Harrison stepped onto the patio, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the long day, his navy suit impeccable even after what had clearly been hours of patient consultations. His eyes swept across the graduation setup, taking in the white lights, the congratulatory banners, and the stunned faces of my family members before finally settling on me with unmistakable recognition and professional respect. Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine warmth and collegial admiration. I hope I'm not interrupting your family celebration. I was hoping we could discuss the Chen case we talked about earlier this week. The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear a neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. Every person on that patio was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something approaching terror, as if I had suddenly transformed into a completely different species before their eyes. Ryan appeared behind Dr. Harrison, his face a mask of complete bewilderment mixed with growing panic. Dr. Harrison, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. My sister Lydia isn't a doctor. She dropped out of medical school years ago. She works the night shift cleaning bathrooms at the hospital. She lives in a studio apartment and drives a car that's falling apart. There's no way she could be the cardiac surgeon you're looking for. Dropped out of medical school? Samuel said, his voice carrying genuine surprise and concern. Ryan, I think we need to clear this up. Dr. Lydia Thorne is not only a practicing physician, but she's one of the most accomplished cardiac surgeons I've had the privilege to work with.
He turned back to me, his face showing the kind of respect that I'd grown accustomed to in professional settings, but had never experienced in this backyard. Doctor, I wanted to follow up on our discussion about the pediatric case you're taking on next week. The parents are flying in from Denver specifically for your expertise. The words hung in the air like an accusation.
and I could feel the weight of 8 years of deception crashing down around me. There was no way to deflect this, no way to maintain the fiction, no way to pretend that Dr. Harrison had somehow mistaken me for someone else. Cameron began scrolling frantically through his phone, his fingers shaking as he typed. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice growing more desperate with each swipe. "Lydia, tell him he's wrong. Tell him you're not a doctor." But Uncle Marcus had beaten him to it, and his face was growing paler with each search result. "Oh my God," he whispered, staring at his phone screen. "There are articles, medical journal publications. Dr. L. Thorne, cardiac surgery. Lydia, this is you. This is actually you." He held up his phone with a trembling hand, showing everyone a photograph from the Millbrook Medical Center website. It was me, wearing surgical scrubs and a white coat, standing in front of the cardiac surgery unit with the confident smile of someone completely at home in her professional environment. "That's impossible," Ryan said, but his voice had lost all conviction. He was staring at the phone screen like it contained information written in a foreign language that he couldn't possibly comprehend. Natalie grabbed the phone from Uncle Marcus, her perfectly manicured fingers clicking frantically against the screen. "Metropolitan Heart Institute," she read aloud, her voice growing more amazed and horrified with each word. "Dr. L. Thorne, Chief of Cardiac Surgery, specializing in complex congenital heart defects and innovative surgical techniques." She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of awe and something that might have been fear. "Lydia, you're the chief of cardiac surgery? You're the chief of an entire department?" Dad was fumbling with his own phone now, his hands shaking as he tried to navigate the search results. "Harvard Medical School guest lecturer," he read in a voice barely above a whisper. "American College of Surgeons, Surgeon of the Year Award, International Cardiac Surgery Conference keynote speaker." Each new discovery hit the patio like a physical blow. Mom had pressed both hands to her chest and was breathing in short, quick gasps. Mrs. Henderson was clutching the arm of her chair as if she might fall over. Jake was staring at me with the kind of wonder usually reserved for meeting celebrities. Dr. Harrison looked around at the family's shocked faces with growing confusion. "I'm sorry, I seem to have walked into some kind of family misunderstanding. Ryan, were you not aware of your sister's medical career?" "Medical career?" Ryan repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "She doesn't have a medical career. She mops floors. She lives in a studio apartment and drives a Honda that's falling apart. She makes maybe $30,000 a year." "30,000?" Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Ryan, I think there's been a significant miscommunication. Dr. Thorne is one of the highest paid surgeons in the region. Her consultation fees alone are more than most people's annual salaries." Aunt Beverly was scrolling through what appeared to be medical association websites, her face growing more astonished by the second. Board certifications, multiple hospital affiliations, published research papers. "Lydia, there are dozens of research papers with your name on them." She looked up at me with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their quiet neighbor was secretly a famous movie star. "You've published research in cardiac surgery journals. You're cited by other doctors. You're actually famous in the medical world." Jake had found something else on his phone, and his voice carried the excitement of an 18-year-old who had just discovered something incredible about someone he thought he knew. "Aunt Lydia, there's a video here from last year's medical conference. You're giving a presentation about some new surgical technique you developed. The comments are all from other doctors saying how brilliant you are." He held up his phone, and there I was on the small screen, standing at a podium in front of hundreds of medical professionals, explaining a cardiac procedure I had pioneered. The video showed me in my element, confident and authoritative, speaking with the expertise that came from years of saving lives in operating rooms across the region. "That's really you," Mom whispered, staring at the video with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "That's my daughter speaking to all those doctors like she's one of the leading experts in her field," Dr. Harrison completed gently. "Because she is. Dr. Thorne, I hope you don't mind me saying so, but your family seems genuinely surprised by your professional achievements." Ryan was still frantically searching his phone, as if he could somehow find information that would make this all make sense. "The salary," he said suddenly, his voice hollow with shock. "What does a cardiac surgeon actually make?" Dr. Harrison paused diplomatically.
I don't think it would be appropriate for me to discuss Dr. Thorne's personal finances, but I can say that cardiac surgery is among the highest paid medical specialties. Uncle Marcus had found what appeared to be a medical salary website. According to this, he said, his voice barely audible, cardiac surgeons in this region average between 600,000 and 1.2 million annually, depending on experience and reputation.
The numbers seemed to echo across the patio like a thunderclap. Natalie actually gasped out loud. Dad's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered on the brick pavement. Aunt Beverly was making small whimpering sounds of disbelief. $1 million? Ryan whispered, staring at me like I had suddenly sprouted wings. Lydia, you make $1 million a year? Dr. Harrison looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Perhaps I should let your family process this information privately. Dr. Thorne, if you have a moment later this week, could we schedule a time to discuss the Chen case? I finally found my voice, though it came out steadier than I felt. Of course, Dr. Harrison. Thank you for stopping by to congratulate Jake on his graduation. He nodded professionally, then turned to Ryan with the kind of gentle concern that doctors reserve for patients who are processing difficult news. Ryan, I think you and your family have some catching up to do. Your sister is truly remarkable, not just as a surgeon, but as a person. You should be very proud of her. As Dr. Harrison made his way back through the house toward his car, the patio remained frozen in stunned silence. The only sound was Uncle Marcus continuing to scroll through search results, occasionally muttering phrases like innovative procedures and internationally recognized expertise. Jake was the first to break the silence. Aunt Lydia, he said, his voice filled with awe and confusion, are you really one of the top heart surgeons in the country? I looked around at the faces of my family, these people who had spent the evening discussing my need for career guidance and better job opportunities, these people who had offered me $18 an hour positions and suggested I work my way up to becoming a unit secretary. Yes, I said quietly, I am. The admission seemed to unlock something in the group because suddenly everyone was talking at once, voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock, questions, and desperate attempts to make sense of what they had just learned. But the apartment, Natalie sputtered, the old car, the scrubs that look like custodial uniforms. Props, I said simply. The apartment on Cedar Street that you think I live in, I rent it to maintain this fiction. My actual home is in Hillbrook Heights. The Honda is one of several cars I own. I wear medical scrubs to family events because they're comfortable, and because they fit the image you all created of me. Ryan was shaking his head in complete denial. This can't be real. If I were really this successful, I would have known. Someone would have told me. Someone at the hospital would have mentioned it. Why would they? Most people in the medical community know me as Dr. L. Thorne. My professional life and my family life have been completely separate for 8 years. Why would anyone at Riverside General connect their cardiac surgery chief to the custodian that Ryan Thorne occasionally mentions? The questions kept coming, each one revealing just how completely they had misunderstood every aspect of my life. But the most painful question came from Mom, her voice breaking with emotion and confusion. Sweetheart, if you're really this successful, why didn't you tell us? Why let us worry about you? Why let us think you were struggling? And that was the question I had been dreading for 8 years. The one that would require me to explain not just what I had hidden, but why I had hidden it. I stood up slowly from my corner chair and, for the first time in 8 years, I allowed my real self to emerge from behind the carefully constructed facade I had maintained for so long. When I spoke, my voice carried the quiet authority I used when addressing medical residents and consulting with other physicians, the tone that commanded attention in operating rooms where life and death decisions were made every day. So,
Since we're all finally operating with accurate information, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about how this family has functioned for the past 8 years. Ryan started to speak, but I held up a hand with the same gesture I used to maintain sterile conditions during surgery, and he immediately fell silent. The movement was small, but the authority it represented was absolute. For the first time in our adult relationship, I was the one setting the parameters of our interaction. Ryan, let's start with you. For 8 years, you have treated me like a charity case. You've dismissed my work, mocked my supposed limitations, and spoken to me like I was a child who couldn't grasp basic concepts about professional success. His face flushed red, but he seemed unable to find words to respond. Just tonight, I continued, you offered me career advice about being realistic and suggested I consider whether I had the temperament for high-pressure situations or life-and-death decisions. You questioned whether I was capable of making tough choices under pressure. I paused, letting the weight of his earlier words settle over the patio before delivering the revelation that would complete our role reversal. What you don't know, Ryan, is that while you were questioning my ability to handle responsibility, I was actually making decisions that determine whether families celebrate or grieve. While you were suggesting I wasn't cut out for leadership, I was literally holding human hearts in my hands and bringing people back from the edge of death.
The color drained from Ryan's face so completely that I was momentarily concerned about his cardiac condition. This morning, before coming to Jake's party, I performed surgery on a 6-year-old girl whose parents were told by 3 other hospitals that her case was hopeless. Tonight, that little girl is alive and will grow up to have children of her own because of a procedure I pioneered. But according to you, I lack the intelligence and fortitude for challenging work. Ryan's mouth moved soundlessly, and Natalie reached over to grip his arm as if to steady him. I turned to address Uncle Marcus, who was still clutching his phone like a lifeline to reality. Uncle Marcus, you spent considerable time tonight explaining that some people are natural leaders while others are natural followers, and that I clearly fell into the second category. You suggested that I wasn't cut out for business or leadership responsibilities. Uncle Marcus's face had gone completely pale, and his phone was trembling in his hands. I want you to know that I currently oversee surgical teams of up to 20 medical professionals during complex procedures. I manage budgets for 3 different hospital departments totaling over $15 million annually. I make decisions every day that affect not just individual patients, but entire families and medical protocols that are adopted by hospitals across the country. I let that information settle before continuing. You also mentioned tonight that I should accept that not everyone can handle enormous responsibility. Last month, I was asked by the State Medical Board to review and approve new cardiac surgery protocols that will affect how heart procedures are performed in every hospital in our region. The governor personally called to thank me for my contributions to medical care in our state. Uncle Marcus made a small sound that might have been a whimper. Aunt Beverly, I said, turning to my father's sister. You graciously offered me an $18 an hour position in building maintenance tonight. You presented this as an opportunity for me to finally achieve some basic financial stability and escape what you perceived as my desperate circumstances. Aunt Beverly was clutching her wine glass so tightly, I was concerned it might shatter. I want you to understand that my consultation fees for complex cardiac cases start at $5,000 per procedure. Last week, I earned more in a single day than your generous job offer would have paid me in 6 months. The financial stability you were trying to help me achieve represents less than what I typically spend on a weekend. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Aunt Beverly's face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and dawning realization of just how drastically she had misunderstood my circumstances. I addressed Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching the systematic dismantling of assumptions with growing horror. Mrs. Henderson,
You shared the inspiring story of your daughter's friend who worked her way up from hospital maintenance to become a unit secretary after 15 years of dedicated service. You suggested this as a potential career path that someone like me might aspire to achieve. Mrs. Henderson pressed her lips together, clearly dreading what was coming next. I want you to know that the unit secretaries in the cardiac surgery departments where I work report to supervisors, who report to department heads, who ultimately report to me. The career advancement you described as an inspirational success story represents multiple levels beneath my current position in hospital hierarchy. But it was my parents' reaction that affected me most profoundly. Mom and Dad were staring at me with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of awe, shame, and what might have been pride, if pride could coexist with the dawning realization of how completely they had failed to understand their own daughter. Mom, Dad, I said, my voice softening slightly but maintaining its newfound authority, you spent this evening discussing my need to find appropriate work and suggesting that maybe you had been enabling my unrealistic expectations by not pushing me harder to accept my limitations. Mom's eyes filled with tears and Dad's hands were visibly shaking. You worried about whether I was eating properly, sleeping enough, and managing the physical demands of my supposedly menial job. You spoke about me with the gentle concern usually reserved for someone with diminished capacity who was doing their best within significant limitations. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the outdoor table where everyone could see it. While you were worrying about my ability to pay my bills, I was actually in a position to solve some of your financial concerns. Dad, remember how you've been stressed about the roof repairs and Mom's medical expenses from her knee surgery? Remember staying awake at night, worried about stretching your retirement savings? Dad's voice came out as barely a whisper. Lydia, what are you saying? I'm saying those concerns are over. The envelope contains documentation showing that your mortgage has been paid off, your medical bills have been cleared, and there's enough in an account I've established to cover your living expenses comfortably for the rest of your lives. Mom burst into tears, covering her face with her hands, while Dad stared at the envelope like it contained information written in a foreign language. But sweetheart, Mom whispered through her tears, why didn't you tell us? Why let us worry when you were in a position to help?
The question hung in the air, and I realized this was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating for 8 years. Because, Mom, you never asked what I actually needed or what I was actually achieving. You decided what my life looked like based on a single misunderstanding, and then you spent 8 years reinforcing that narrative without ever investigating whether your assumptions were accurate. I looked around the patio at each family member in turn. Every single one of you made judgments about my intelligence, my capabilities, and my potential based on what you thought you knew rather than what was actually true. You offered me pity instead of respect, charity instead of recognition, and condescension instead of curiosity. Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and shaken. But Lydia, if you were really this successful, why hide it from us? Why let us think you were struggling? Because, Ryan, I discovered something important about how you all operated as a family. Your treatment of me wasn't based on my actual circumstances. It was based on your need to maintain a certain hierarchy, where you were the successful one and I was the cautionary tale. I turned to face him directly. You needed me to be the sister who couldn't handle pressure, so you could be the brother who thrived under it. You needed me to be the one who lacked ambition, so your achievements would seem more impressive by comparison. The accusation hung between us like a scalpel cutting through years of accumulated assumptions. When I realized that revealing my success wouldn't change how you treated me, it would just threaten the family narrative you had all constructed, I decided to see how long you would maintain these patterns. 8 years, it turns out. 8 years of offering career advice to someone who was already more successful than any of you could imagine. Natalie was staring at her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be medical association websites. Lydia? She said faintly.
There are articles here about surgical innovations you've developed. You're not just successful, you're actually advancing medical science. You're saving lives in ways that didn't exist before you created them. That's correct, I confirmed. While you were all discussing whether I had the temperament for responsibility, I was literally creating new ways to save human lives. While you worried about my ability to handle pressure, I was pioneering surgical techniques that are now taught in medical schools. Jake, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. Aunt Lydia, does this mean that all those times you asked about my science projects and seemed really interested in my biology classes, you weren't just being nice? For the first time that evening, I smiled genuinely. Jake, I have a medical degree from Harvard and specialized training in cardiac surgery. When I showed interest in your academic work, it was because I actually understood what you were learning and could appreciate your potential. He stared at me with something approaching wonder. You've been my aunt who's a famous heart surgeon this whole time and I had no idea? Famous might be overstating it, but yes, I've been your aunt who saves lives for a living, while everyone assumed I mopped floors. The conversation continued around the patio, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Where an hour ago they had looked at me with pity and gentle condescension, now there was wariness, respect, and in some cases something that looked like fear. They were beginning to understand that the person they had patronized and pitied for 8 years was actually the most accomplished member of their family, and that every piece of advice they had offered revealed the depth of their own limitations rather than mine. The silence that followed my confrontation stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of neighbors cleaning up from their own evening gatherings and the soft hum of cicadas in the summer air. I could see each family member processing not just the revelation of my true profession, but the implications of how they had treated me for 8 years. Ryan was the first to attempt a response, his voice shaky and uncertain in a way I had never heard before. Lydia, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. I genuinely believed you were struggling, that you needed help and guidance. Did you? I asked quietly. Or did you need to believe that I was struggling because it made your own success feel more significant? The question hung in the air like a diagnosis that no one wanted to hear but couldn't deny. I think that we need to establish some new ground rules for how this family operates going forward. The days of casual condescension disguised as concern are over. The assumptions about my capabilities, my intelligence, and my life choices end tonight. Dad cleared his throat nervously, his hand still trembling as he reached for the envelope I had placed on the table. Sweetheart, about this financial help you're offering, we can't accept it. Not after how we've treated you. We don't deserve your generosity. I studied my father's face, seeing genuine shame there along with the bewilderment of someone whose entire worldview had been upended in the course of a single evening. Dad, this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what family does when they have the resources to help. The difference is that now you know I'm helping you from a position of strength, rather than receiving help from a position of weakness.
Mom wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression I was still learning to interpret. But why, Lydia? After everything we said, everything we assumed, why would you still want to help us? It was a fair question, and one I had wrestled with while arranging their financial security earlier that week. Because despite everything, you're still my parents. Because I remember who you were before success and failure became the only metrics that mattered in this family. And because I want to prove that achievement doesn't have to make someone cruel or vindictive. Ryan flinched at the implied criticism, but he didn't argue with it. There will be conditions, though, I continued, and I saw several people tense around the table. This family is going to change how it operates. The casual dismissal of people's worth based on incomplete information stops now. The assumption that success only looks one way ends tonight. I turned to address Ryan specifically. You're going to learn to ask questions instead of making assumptions. When someone in this family shares something about their work or their life, you're going to listen with curiosity instead of judgment. Ryan nodded frantically.
Yes, absolutely. I promise, Lydia, I'll do better. I hope so. Because, Ryan, I need you to understand something important. I've spent 8 years watching how you treat people you perceive as beneath you. Tonight revealed that your kindness is conditional on your sense of superiority. That's going to change. The words hit him like a physical blow, and I could see him struggling to process the accusation. But more importantly, I continued, I want you to think about Jake and the lessons you've been teaching him about how to treat people who don't fit his definition of success. Jake looked stricken. Aunt Lydia, I never meant to be condescending to you. I thought I was being supportive. You were being supportive, Jake, but you were also unconsciously absorbing the family's assumptions about what different types of work mean about a person's worth. I want you to remember tonight when you meet people whose success isn't immediately visible or doesn't match your expectations. I turned to Uncle Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since his phone searches had revealed the scope of my professional achievements. Uncle Marcus, you mentioned earlier that some people aren't cut out for high-pressure careers or leadership roles. I want you to consider how many people you might have written off based on incomplete information. Uncle Marcus nodded slowly, his face showing genuine remorse. Lydia, I owe you an apology that goes beyond tonight. I've been making assumptions about people's capabilities my entire career, and I'm realizing how much damage that kind of thinking can cause. The good news is that awareness is the first step toward change. And Uncle Marcus, I want you to know that my companies are always looking for experienced insurance professionals who understand the importance of really knowing their clients before making assumptions about their needs. The suggestion wasn't lost on him. His small insurance agency depended heavily on commercial accounts, and a relationship with someone at my level of business success could transform his company's prospects. Aunt Beverly had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, but she finally found her voice. Lydia, the job I offered you tonight, I realize now how insulting it must have sounded. An $18 an hour position to someone who earns more in a day than most people make in months. It wasn't insulting because of the salary difference. It was insulting because you never asked what I actually needed or wanted. You assumed that any opportunity would be better than what I had without taking the time to understand what I actually had. Beverly nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I work in human resources. I should know better than to make assumptions about people's circumstances or capabilities. This is exactly the kind of bias we train managers to avoid. Then maybe this experience will make you better at your job, I replied. Maybe you'll remember tonight the next time you're tempted to categorize someone based on limited information. Mrs. Henderson, who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed, finally spoke up. Lydia, I owe you an apology. I've been watching you grow up since you were a child, and I should have had more faith in your abilities. I let myself believe that medical school was too much for you without ever questioning whether that assessment was accurate. Mrs. Henderson, you were responding to the information you had. The problem was that no one in this family bothered to verify whether that information was correct. I looked around the patio at each family member, seeing the mixture of shame, confusion, and dawning respect in their expressions. I want to be clear about something. I'm not angry about the past 8 years. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry. What happened revealed something important about family dynamics and assumptions that needed to be addressed. Mom reached across the table and touched my hand hesitantly. Sweetheart, can you forgive us? Can we find a way to move forward from this? I considered her question carefully. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be switched on like a light, but it was something that could be earned through changed behavior over time.
Mom, I think we can build something better than what we had before, but it's going to require everyone in this family to examine their assumptions about success, worth, and how we treat people whose lives we don't fully understand. Jake, who had been processing everything with the adaptability of youth, looked up with genuine curiosity. Aunt Lydia, will you tell us about your work now? I mean, really tell us. I want to understand what you actually do. The question was simple, but it represented exactly the kind of curiosity that had been missing from our family interactions for years. I'd be happy to, Jake. I perform surgeries that repair heart defects.
often in patients who have been told their conditions are inoperable. I develop new techniques that allow us to save lives that couldn't be saved before. And I teach other doctors how to perform these procedures so that more patients can benefit from advances in cardiac care. That's incredible, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You're literally saving lives and advancing medical science. Why didn't we know this? How did we get it so wrong? Because, I said, everyone stopped asking questions and started making assumptions. The moment this family decided they knew what my life looked like, they stopped being curious about what it actually looked like. Ryan was still staring at his phone, scrolling through articles about my professional achievements. Lydia, there are dozens of research papers here with your name on them. You've presented at medical conferences around the world. You're not just successful, you're actually famous in your field. Recognition within the medical community comes with the territory. But Ryan, I want you to think about something. All those times you mentioned your sister who works at the hospital to colleagues and clients, you were actually talking about someone who has achieved more professional recognition than you realized was possible. The implication was clear. While Ryan had been building his reputation as a successful lawyer, his sister had been building an international reputation as a medical innovator. Natalie looked up from her own phone search, her face showing a mixture of amazement and something that might have been embarrassment. Lydia, I'm reading about a cardiac surgery technique you pioneered that's now used in hospitals across the country. Doctors are crediting you with saving thousands of lives. Innovation in medicine is collaborative, but yes, I've been fortunate to contribute to advances in cardiac care. The conversation continued as family members asked tentative questions about my work, my achievements, and my actual life. For the first time in 8 years, they were approaching me with genuine curiosity rather than in condescending assumptions. But the most important change wasn't in their questions, it was in their recognition that they had spent nearly a decade systematically underestimating someone whose achievements exceeded anything they had imagined possible. As the evening wound down and people began to gather their things, the dynamic on the patio had shifted completely. Where hours earlier they had seen someone who needed their help and guidance, they now saw someone whose success and expertise commanded respect. The performance was over. The deception had ended. And my family was beginning to understand that the person they had pitied was actually the person they should have been learning from all along. 4 months had passed since that transformative evening at Jake's graduation party, and the ripple effects of that night continued to reshape every aspect of our family relationships. As I sat in my real office on the 32nd floor of Millbrook Medical Tower, reviewing patient files for the week's upcoming surgeries, I reflected on how fundamentally everything had changed. The complex cardiac surgery I had mentioned to Dr. Harrison that evening had been a complete success. David Chen, the engineer from Baltimore, had recovered fully and returned to work with a completely repaired heart. His case had been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the technique I had used was now being taught at medical schools across the country. But more importantly to me, David was alive to celebrate his first birthday next month. The professional recognition continued to accumulate. Just last week, I had been invited to join the advisory board for the International Cardiac Surgery Institute, a position that would involve consulting on medical innovations worldwide. The invitation had come with a note from the director of the institute praising my contributions to advancing the boundaries of what's possible in cardiac care. But the most significant changes had happened much closer to home. Ryan had surprised me in ways I hadn't expected. In the months following that evening, he had thrown himself into genuine self-reflection with the same intensity he once brought to legal cases. He had started therapy to examine his patterns of interaction with others, particularly his tendency to derive self-worth from comparing himself favorably to people he perceived as less successful. More impressively, he had begun volunteering at a legal aid clinic, providing free services to clients who couldn't afford traditional legal representation.
When I asked him about this new commitment, he had simply said, "I realized I needed to learn how to help people without looking down on them." The change in Ryan's behavior toward me was dramatic, but felt genuine. He asked questions about my work with real curiosity, sought my advice on medical issues affecting his legal clients, and had even referred several cases to me where clients needed cardiac consultations. Our conversations had developed a depth and mutual respect that had been completely absent for years.
Most remarkably, he had changed how he spoke about success and achievement in front of Jake and his twin daughters. I had overheard him telling them about the importance of really getting to know people before making judgments about their capabilities or worth. Natalie had undergone her own transformation. After learning about my charitable giving, she had approached me about collaborating on a more substantial community health initiative. Together, we had established the Millbrook Heart Health Foundation, which provided free cardiac screenings for underserved populations and funded treatment for patients who couldn't afford necessary procedures. Her event planning expertise and my medical connections had proven to be a powerful combination. The foundation had already screened over 800 people and had identified dozens of serious cardiac conditions that might otherwise have gone undetected until they became life-threatening emergencies. My parents had struggled the most with adjusting to the new reality. The revelation that their supposedly unsuccessful daughter was actually the most accomplished member of the family had forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about parenting, success, and family dynamics. Dad had started reading medical journals and business publications, not to check up on my work, but to better understand the field I had mastered. He would call occasionally to discuss articles about cardiac surgery innovations or to ask thoughtful questions about the challenges facing modern healthcare. Mom had perhaps made the most touching adjustment. She had begun volunteering at the Children's Cardiac Unit at Riverside General, the same hospital where she had imagined I mopped floors. The nursing staff there knew her as Dr. Thorne's mother, and she had told me how proud it made her to be recognized that way. "I spent so many years worrying about you," she had said during a recent phone call, "when I should have been bragging about you to everyone I met." The financial security I had provided them had allowed Dad to pursue some retirement dreams he had put aside, and Mom to focus on volunteer work that gave her a sense of purpose. But more importantly, it had removed the stress that had been affecting their health and their marriage. Jake had become one of my most enthusiastic supporters. As he began his freshman year at Princeton, he had chosen to focus on pre-med studies, inspired partly by learning about his aunt's career. He called regularly to discuss his biology and chemistry courses, and I had become his unofficial mentor in understanding the realities of medical education. "I never realized how much I could learn from you," he had said during his last visit home. "All those years you were right there, and I had no idea I was talking to someone who could answer questions I didn't even know to ask." His perspective on success and achievement had matured significantly since that graduation night. He spoke now about wanting to make a meaningful contribution to the world, rather than simply achieving status or recognition. Uncle Marcus had made practical changes to his business practices based on what he learned about the dangers of making assumptions about clients. His insurance agency had actually grown substantially after he began taking the time to really understand his customers' needs, rather than categorizing them based on superficial information. He had also become one of my most reliable referral sources, connecting me with clients who needed cardiac consultations and recommending my services to other business owners who might benefit from my expertise. Aunt Beverly had perhaps learned the most professional relevant lesson from our confrontation. She had implemented new training programs at her company focused on recognizing and avoiding unconscious bias in hiring and employee evaluation. Her efforts had been so successful that she had been promoted to regional HR director and was now invited to speak at industry conferences about inclusive workplace practices. Mrs. Henderson had become my unofficial publicist in the neighborhood, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her friend's daughter who was a famous heart surgeon. Her enthusiasm was enduring, and it had actually led to several referrals from families who needed cardiac care.
But the most meaningful change was in how our family gatherings functioned. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had resumed, but with a completely different atmosphere. Instead of offering career advice or expressing concern about my supposedly limited prospects, family members asked genuine questions about my work and listened to my answers with real interest. The conversations had become richer and more engaging as people felt free to share their own achievements and challenges without fear of judgment or condescending advice. Ryan talked about his pro bono work with the same pride he once reserved for his most lucrative cases. Jake discussed his academic challenges and successes with the confidence of someone who knew his family supported his efforts regardless of the outcome. I found myself sharing more about my professional life than I had in years. I told them about the medical conferences I attended, the research I was conducting, and the innovations I was developing. For the first time, my family knew what I actually did during my days, and they responded with the kind of pride and interest that I had watched them show for Ryan's achievements for so many years. The most recent family dinner had included a celebration of my latest professional milestone. I had been named Physician of the Year by the American Heart Association, an honor that recognized both my clinical excellence and my contributions to advancing cardiac surgery techniques.
As I accepted their congratulations, I realized that this was what family support was supposed to feel like. Recognition based on actual knowledge of someone's achievements, rather than polite encouragement based on misconceptions about their struggles. The financial aspects of my deception had also been resolved in ways that felt healthy for everyone involved. My parents were using their newfound security to travel and pursue interests they had deferred during their working years. Ryan had established a scholarship fund for students from low-income families pursuing legal careers. Jake was planning to use part of his inheritance to fund medical school without accumulating crushing debt. Most importantly, the family had learned to recognize and value different types of success and contribution. They had stopped measuring everyone against a single standard of achievement and had begun appreciating the diverse ways that people could make meaningful impacts on the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, who was calling from Princeton. Aunt Lydia, my organic chemistry professor, mentioned your research in today's lecture. She said your work on cardiac tissue regeneration is revolutionizing how we think about heart repair. I told her you were my aunt, and she couldn't believe it. She wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to our pre-med society next semester. I smiled and typed back, I'd be honored to speak to your group. And Jake, I'm proud of how seriously you're approaching your studies. His response came quickly. Learning from the best. Can't wait to follow in your footsteps, even if it takes me years to achieve what you've already accomplished. The exchange represented everything that had changed about our family dynamics. Instead of assumptions and condescension, there was mutual respect and genuine support. Instead of pity and misguided advice, there was celebration of actual achievements and meaningful encouragement. As I prepared to leave the office for another Sunday dinner with my family, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The 8 years of deception had been painful and isolating, but they had served an important purpose. They had revealed patterns of thinking and behavior that needed to be addressed, and had ultimately led to more authentic and respectful relationships. The girl who had once been made to feel small enough to fit into their narrow definitions of success had grown into a woman who could redefine success for everyone around her. The sister they had pitied was now the person they turned to for guidance and expertise. More importantly, I was finally living authentically in every aspect of my life. I no longer had to remember which version of myself to present in different contexts. I could simply be Dr. Lydia Thorne, cardiac surgeon, medical innovator, and daughter who had achieved more than her family had ever imagined possible. The elaborate deception was over, but the relationships it had ultimately created were just beginning. As I locked my office door and headed home to Sunday dinner with people who finally knew and appreciated who I really was, I realized that sometimes the most important truths require the most dramatic revelations. But once those truths are finally spoken,
They have the power to transform not just individual relationships, but entire families' understanding of what it means to succeed, to support each other, and to see people as they truly are, rather than as we assume them to be. Tonight, I would sit at that same dining room table where I had once been offered career guidance about becoming a unit secretary. But now I would sit there as myself, accomplished, respected, and finally free to exist fully in every aspect of my life. And that transformation, I thought, was worth every difficult conversation it had taken to achieve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.